At one point in my life, I was studying to be a paramedic. And I remember one of my placements, we went to a house that was kind of covered in darkness, and we turned the external lights on of the van. And what we saw was a woman kind of walking out of her house holding her baby, and her baby was not breathing. And it was at that kind of moment, as I was with these paramedics on my placement, that I realized that some people react very well to new situations, don't they? These paramedics kind of walked up confidently to this woman. They took her baby and they put the baby on the table and began resuscitation immediately. And before my eyes, within a couple minutes, the baby was awake and breathing and fine. And I was sitting there like a bunny staring a headlight, not moving, not being very helpful. You could tell I was very much on one of my first placements. It was a scary situation. But paramedics and emergency services, the best of them really come out in situations like that, don't they? Those kinds of guys, they just know how to respond. When a new situation, a new crazy situation comes about, it really brings out the best of who they are. They say calm, they seem collected, nothing seems to rock them, and they seem to be able to handle any scenario that comes over the radio. It's amazing. I'm glad there's men and women out there like that in the world. But not all of us react that way to new situations, do we? Not all of us react that well to new situations. Sometimes a new situation for us can bring out the worst in us. The newly graduated Year 12 student who's had a new lease on life, they're finally free, an adult, and out of school, ends up doing things they never said they would do. The couple who has entered into a new rough patch in their marriage ends up individually finding intimacy in ways they never thought they would succumb to. The couple that's been hustling for years and years to be able to finally get some money in their bank account, they finally have enough now in there to feel comfortable, but now in this new season of generosity and bountifulness, they end up being less generous than when they had no money at all. New seasons can be quite tricky for us humans. They can bring out the best of us, but they can really also bring out the worst. And the thing is, we can't avoid new seasons, can we? Each new day presents new things we have to experience, and new seasons are always around the corner. We can't really stick our head in the sand, can we? It doesn't work like that. And so we've got to figure out how we can handle new situations, how we can handle new seasons well and appropriately. But before we figure out how to handle new situations well, though, there's a step that must come first. And the step that has to come first is we've got to know how to handle the situations we've discovered that we've made a mess of. What options we have when we discover we've set off in a different course due to poorly reacting to a new situation or season in our life. That's what we need to get a handle of first. And to help us with that, we're going to look at 1 Samuel chapter 12 as we look at Israel and their reaction to a particular situation. So turn there now, if you haven't already, 1 Samuel chapter 12, and we'll look at verse 1 together. And Samuel said to all of Israel, "Behold, I have obeyed your voice in all that you have said to me, and have made a king over you." You might recall a few months ago we looked at 1 Samuel chapter 8, and that was a new situation which Israel encountered. Samuel, the man who God had kind of risen up in Israel to save them from a variety of different situations, was now old. And his sons, who were supposed to come up after him and serve after him and were serving as judges, actually ended up being corrupt. They were taking briberies, they were abusing justice. They just weren't good judges. And so the leaders of the nation of Israel called Samuel and they said, "We have a solution to you being old. And the solution is we want you to make us a king." Israel had never had a king before. God had always been considered their king. And not just any king, what they had was they had these things called judges, and judges, what they would do is they would serve over like kind of small pockets of kind of geographic regions in Israel, and they would serve there as like political leaders, but they would kind of also serve as like war heroes. You might recall Samson or Gideon in the Bible. They were judges just like Samuel. But now Israel wanted to move on from that political setup to a new situation. They wanted a king, and not just any king. They wanted a king like the other nations, as they wanted to be like the other nations around them. And so in 1 Samuel chapter 8, you might recall when Samuel heard this news and this request, he was not very fond of the idea, was he? He saw through the request for what it was, that Israel wasn't just wanting a king, they were actually rejecting God as their king in the process. They were wanting to replace God with a man. They're wanting to be like the world and look like the world, all without God. And so Samuel objected to this request. But interestingly, what we saw in 1 Samuel chapter 8 is despite this, God allowed Israel to get a king, which is what we've been exploring over the last few chapters. In chapters 8 to 12, we saw how Israel shifted from this kind of federation of different tribes into being a monarchy. In chapter 9, we came across the man, you might recall, who God said was going to be king, King Saul. And he was tall, he was handsome, he was young, he looked like he fit the bill. And then in chapter 10, you might recall, we saw God reveal publicly who this king would be to Israel. And there he was, tall, handsome, and young. And everyone was like, yep, this is a good gig. However, as we get towards the end of chapter 10, we realize that not everybody's a big fan of this idea. After all, when Saul's lot was called, his name was called out to be this king, he wasn't found, was he? He was actually hiding in the baggage area, in the luggage, kind of skipping out on his responsibility at that time. So nobody was very keen on this new king. But then chapter 11 came around, which we'll cover briefly this morning. Chapter 11 came around, and we saw there in the beginning of chapter 11, we see King Saul take on the Ammonites. And he has a great victory. And so whoever is very, very excited about this king, he goes, yep, no, actually he is good for the role. And so Samuel calls Israel to go to a place called Gilgal at the end of chapter 12 to finalize Saul being made a king, which is where we find ourselves today. Samuel's intention was to renew the kingdom, as in get people to establish Saul as king to all in that place, in that kingdom. And as you look at the end of 1 Samuel chapter 11, you see that's exactly what happens. They make him king. But as you see in chapter 12, that's not the only thing that happened at that time of that ceremony. There's more to this ceremony on when Samuel called them all to Gilgal than meets the eye. You see, Samuel's intention was not just to establish Saul in his role to all, but at the same time, Samuel wanted to renew God's kingdom as well, and not just Saul's. And this quickly becomes apparent in chapter 12, where Samuel summarizes what's gone on. He says, behold, I've obeyed your voice and all that you've said to me, and have made a king over you. What Israel wanted, Samuel has provided. But don't miss the way that Samuel speaks here in this verse. The language he uses of obey is the same words that God says back in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 9. When Israel requested a king, God said to Samuel this, now then obey their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the kings who shall reign over them. So what Israel wanted, Samuel provided, but Israel only got what they wanted because God allowed them to get it. You get it? Samuel is obeying the people only because God wanted him to. And so in verse 2 he says, and now behold, the king walks before you, and I am old and grey. And behold, my sons are with you. I have walked before you from my youth until this day. Samuel obeyed the people, and now before them is this king. It's almost like as if here Samuel is comparing himself to this king at this point. He's the old judge, prophet, and priest who's been there since his youth. And here is the new shiny king himself before their eyes. And in verse 3 to 5, he starts pushing this point a bit further, speaking as if everybody was in this kind of courtroom drama, right? He puts Israel in the chair of the prosecution, and then Samuel puts himself in the dock as the accused. And he says to them, "Here I am, testify against me before the Lord and before his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? Or whose donkey have I taken? Or whom have I defrauded? Whom have I oppressed? Or from whose hand have I taken a bribe to blind my eyes with it? Testify against me, and I will restore it to you." I used to work in IT, so I know what it means to work with new and shiny things. We used to go into businesses and upgrade old things and replace them with new things and give them new ways so they would be more efficient. I really enjoyed it, especially the times where you could save businesses a number of hours per week in what we did. But there's a trick with IT. The thing about IT is that every product and everything promises to be more efficient than what you had before. But not everything is fit for purpose. Many may work, but only if you have like a staff of 25-year-olds or something, or if you have a blisteringly fast internet speed, or you're a business that never uses like a paper and pen or something like that. Often a lot of products are just plain dreaming. New ways aren't always better than old ways. And many times in my business, we had to preserve the old ways because that actually was going to be more efficient for people. And that is what Samuel is wanting to highlight here, is that the old ways of how Israel did things actually weren't so bad. In Samuel chapter 8, Samuel described that having a king like the nations Israel wanted would be a king who would take and take and take and take and take and take from the people. Because that's often the way of the world, isn't it? Jesus said this once, "For who is greater, one who reclines at table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at table? But I am among you as the one who serves." The way of the world in leadership is often of taking and taking and taking, of lording it over people, taking oxes and donkeys, defrauding, oppressing, taking bribes, but not so is the way of God's people. And this is what Israel had with Samuel. And they said, "You have not defrauded us or oppressed us or taken anything from any man's hand." And he said to them, "The Lord is witness against you, and is anointed as witness this day that you have not found anything in my hand." And they said, "He is witness." The old ways were not so bad with Samuel. And everyone admitted that before God and their new king, that this was true. But what about with God? Was it bad under God? Was it worth upgrading to something new and shiny there for Israel? Samuel keeps up his courtroom drama in verse 7 onwards. "Now therefore stand still, that I may plead with you before the Lord concerning all the righteous deeds of the Lord that he performed for you and for your fathers." As in, stand in the docks yourself, Israel. You're the accused now. Let me bring prosecution against you concerning all the righteous deeds of God. And to do that, Samuel records Israel's history. He says this in verses 8 to 11. "When Jacob went into Egypt and the Egyptians oppressed them, then your fathers cried out to the Lord, and the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your fathers out of Egypt and made them dwell in this place. But they forgot the Lord their God, and he sold them into the hands of Sisera, the commander of the army of Hazor, and in the hand of the Philistines, and in the hand of king of Moab, and they fought against them. And they cried out to the Lord and said, 'We have sinned because we have forsaken the Lord and have served Baals and Ashtaroth and Ashtaroth. But now deliver us out of the hand of our enemies, that we may serve you.' And the Lord sent Jerubbaal and Barak and Japhath and Samuel and delivered you out of the hand of your enemies on every side, and you lived in safety." This is Israel's recent history. Part of God's righteous deeds towards them Israel, Samuel recounts, was God rescuing them from various enemies over and over again. This is how he has always dealt with his people. He was their savior. He saved them from slavery in Egypt. He saved them from enemy nations. He's always acted in this way, even when Israel hadn't been righteous themselves, which is an interesting thing to note. Do you notice how in these verses here that part of God's righteous deeds recalled here is by Samuel is also involved his discipline of Israel? In the covenant or relationship agreement that God had with Israel that we see in Deuteronomy 28, we see spelled out that if Israel was to reject God, the response to that, the God who would save them, would also allow them to face consequences by being defeated by their enemies, which is what we saw over and over again in Israel's history. Like a child living in a house and eating food with clothing and education and friends and support, when they say ungratefully to their parents, "You do nothing for me," so Israel also needed to experience the embarrassment of how they treated God. The embarrassment of realizing how they've been treating God. And that's what happened. God let them face the consequences of their rebellion. But notice what we see here in verse 10. The times when Israel did this in the past and suffered, the consequences of it led them to cry out to God. And God eyes, and he would save them. His discipline was for their ultimate restoration. This is the pattern they carried on over and over and over again, as God over and over and over again had mercy on them. Was it bad under God? Samuel's trying to get out here. No. He saved them, he loved them, he provided for them, and when they ungratefully committed treason against him, he still showed mercy. When things didn't work out for them, they ended up broken and alone and crawling back to him, he still saved. God was righteous towards Israel, merciful and kind to these rebels. Was life under God's reign as king that bad? No, like with Samuel, the old ways weren't that bad at all. And this is what makes Israel's response to a new situation in verse 12 so perplexing. Samuel says, "And when you saw that Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, came against you, you said to me, 'No, but a king shall reign over us,' when the Lord your God was your king." Here in verse 12, we see some extra details about this request for a king way back in 1 Samuel chapter 8. The new situation Israel was facing involved not only Samuel being old, but also they faced a new threat, the Ammonites. Now in chapter 11, this is a threat King Saul addressed as one of the first things we saw him do. And we see there in chapter 11 just how scary these guys actually are, the Ammonites. In chapter 11, we see that they came up against a town of Israel called Jabesh Gilead. And in that town, they realized they were really no match for the Ammonites. And so they sought for a treaty with the king of the Ammonites. And the king of the Ammonites, he complied, but he gave them a condition in verse 2. The condition of the treaty, to make a treaty like that, would require him gouging out the right eye of every person in that town. It's quite a treaty, isn't it? Why would he do that? So Israel could be humiliated. So Israel could be disgraced. So Israel could feel the pain of knowing that they couldn't stop something like this occurring even to one of their very own. They wanted to not only defeat Israel, but the Ammonites wanted to humiliate them. That's a peculiar type of evil, isn't it? This is a scary new threat. Samuel was old, the Ammonites were dangerous people. What was Israel to do when they faced this new situation? Cry out to God for mercy, for help, we might hope? No. As we see in verse 12, unlike the times in the past where Israel wasn't walking with God and cried out to him for deliverance based upon his mercy, he isn't even considered here, it seems in verse 12, to be an option for help. Instead, they wanted something shiny and new. They wanted a shiny and new way of doing things. No, but a king shall reign over us, when the Lord their God was their king. To help Israel see what they have done, Samuel tells them this in verse 13. And now behold the king whom you have chosen. As in, look at him. Behold, the Lord has set a king over you. Now at our place, our neighbour has a wheelie bin that's on its last legs. It's got a kind of a cracked handle and its lid's a bit kind of shaky. And whenever you move the thing, its wheel literally falls off. And there's a long driveway, so it's really a tough gig. To stick to that old wheelie bin, in this case, thinking the old ways are better, so let's keep going the old ways, would just be plain foolish, wouldn't it? Keeping a wheelie bin that ain't very wheelie is a really big mistake. I won't give any more bad puns. You should absolutely get a new wheelie bin, and we have helped our neighbour do that already. Some old ways are not good ways, and we need to change things. But when you see the evidence stacked up high that the old king and his old ways are actually better, then it is plain foolish to fix what ain't broke. Behold the king you've chosen, is what Samuel got them to see. Behold him, a young man, he's tall and handsome. Now, that sounds pretty good. But a man who is flesh and blood. A man who pricks and bleeds when you prick him. A man who we've already seen over the last couple of chapters that seems to have a tendency towards cowardice. Seems to have a tendency towards passivity. Compared to the king who made the whole universe. The king whose proven record of faithfulness is there over and over again despite treachery. Who serves and serves and serves rather than takes and takes and takes. This is who Israel chose over God. Israel looks as like they've ended up with a lemon, doesn't it? With a dud. But in verse 13, we're reminded that yes, this is their choice. But in God's sovereignty, mysteriously, Saul was also God's choice. He's still in the game. And so based upon all this, Samuel highlights the reality of Israel's new monarchy and the situation they find themselves in. He says this in verse 14, if you will fear the Lord and serve him and obey his voice and not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, and if you and the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God, it will be well. But in verse 15, but if you will not obey the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the command of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you and your king. This is a new setup for Israel. It looks very familiar to the old setup of Israel, which we can see over and over again in the previous books of the Bible. Follow God, do what he lovingly commands, and it will be well for you. But notice how it includes the king here in these verses. Israel and the king need to do this. This new king is no exception to the laws of God. In fact, he's under them like the rest of Israel. Israel was to have a king, yes, but this king was to reign under the true king, God himself. And so Israel at this point by Samuel, they're given a choice to make, to renew the kingdom, so to speak. To come again and back and live under the reign of the true king, God himself, with their king, or face the consequences of a path of rejecting God as king. Whereas we saw chapters ago, when God's hand was stretched out against the Philistines, they too would feel the touch of that hand of justice. Before Israel was able to make a decision or speak to the matter, though, Samuel wanted to bring in some creative teaching to the account. It was a time of harvest festival. It was a time of harvest for Israel, which means it was the drier months of the year. And so if rain occurred during these months, it would be very, very rare. In fact, it would probably seem a bit supernatural. However, if it did occur, the rain would actually probably destroy the heads of the wheat crop to be harvested. And so Samuel said this in verses 16 to 18. Now therefore stand still and see the great thing that the Lord will do before your eyes. Is it not wheat harvest today? I will call upon the Lord that he may send thunder and rain, and you shall know and see that your wickedness is great, which you have done in the sight of the Lord in asking for yourselves a king. So Samuel called upon the Lord, and the Lord sent thunder and rain that day, and all the people greatly feared the Lord and Samuel. Samuel wanted Israel to see the great wickedness in their request for a new king to replace God. In life, there are some things that God tells us not to do that we can struggle to see that is actually wrong. As a teenager, I came to this point myself. I convinced myself that what God said and what my parents said was mainly just out of ignorance, right? You know, the wrong they said, the things they said were wrong, you know, might not have actually been that wrong. They probably just didn't know. Sin can't be that bad. But as we know by experience, things can be that bad, can't they? But how do you get someone to see that? How do you get someone to see the horridness of an action? How do you bring someone to their senses that what they're actually doing is actually terribly wicked? Well, Samuel preached the word here, and he also prayed for a storm to come, a sign, a taste of God's holy anger, his righteous justice against sin. And God sent a storm that only God could send, that would damage the crops that Israel had so worked hard to provide for themselves with. He did this so that they could see that God was serious. Sin is serious. So it demands serious consequences. There's a reason those who murder are locked up for life, because their crime is serious. God is not joking around with his laws. He's not a killjoy. When he says something is wrong, it's actually wrong. It's utterly wrong. Or else why would he need to bring justice and judgment for it? And so Samuel prayed to wake up Israel to their wickedness, and a storm came to prove the point. And in verse 19, the people reacted. And all the people said to Samuel, "Pray for your servants to the Lord your God, that we may not die. For we have added to all our sins this evil, to ask ourselves a king. Pray that they will not die." They saw it. They felt the weight of it. There was a man called Peter who would come years and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years after Samuel, who spoke to a big crowd of Israelites too. And he said to them this: "Let all the house of Israel therefore know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified." Peter wanted Israel in his day to wake up to their wickedness as well, their wickedness of crucifying Jesus. You see, Jesus on a cross is a greater wake-up call than any storm could ever be. A man who did no wrong was tied onto two wooden beams. And he had nails hammered through his flesh to secure him onto those beams. And this was only after he was paraded around, exposed, after being whipped over and over again, so as to humiliate him before the crowds. And there, as he was eventually put up and nailed to this cross, his breathing would have been laboring more and more and more and more as he slowly suffocated, failing to grasp the air he needed due to the way he was positioned on that cross. Here was the man Jesus crucified, never done anything wrong, treated as a criminal. Why? Because he needed to die the death that we deserved for sin. That's why God's wrath was poured out on him for our sins. That's the consequence of sins. The consequence of our sins is the crucifixion of Jesus. That's how serious our crimes are against God. And when we behold this crucified man and we realize the seriousness of the sins we did to place him on that tree, how could we not join in with the rest of Israel and say that prayer. Pray for your servants, the Lord your God, that we may not die because of all that we've done. But on that day when that storm came and the people realized their wickedness, Samuel said something quite surprising. He said this in verses 20 to 25. Do not be afraid. You have done all this evil. Do not be afraid. How could Israel not be afraid? They just witnessed the anger of God towards them for things they have actually done through a storm. How could they not be afraid? They should definitely be afraid. If God could bring a storm like that, what's going to stop him from wiping out all of their crops and bringing about a famine in their land? Don't be afraid. You have done all this evil. Why don't they have to be afraid? Well, in verse 20, Samuel goes on. Yet do not turn aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all of your heart, and do not turn aside after empty things that cannot profit or deliver, for they are empty. For the Lord will not forsake his people. For his great name's sake, because it has pleased the Lord to make you a people for himself. Don't be afraid. Carry on serving God. Make him king again of your lives. Don't rely upon earthly kings and powers. They are just empty. They're like shiny new things that we want to rely upon when we enter new and scary situations. Don't turn to them. Rather, turn again to God. Don't be afraid of what you find when you do so, because when you've come to him, you will find a God of grace. Dane Ortland, in his book, Gentle and Lowly, has this helpful analogy to describe how we often think of ourselves in relationship to God. We naturally think of Jesus touching us the way someone reaches out to touch a slug for the first time. You know, face screwed up, cautiously kind of extending an arm and then yelping in disgust when they make first contact. But that's not true of the God of the Bible. That's not true of Jesus. In verse 22, Samuel highlights that God is not the God who forsakes his people. In fact, as you look at the motivations for being merciful to his people by sticking by them, it's not because they're really good or they're really nice or really intelligent or they're really just worth it. No, his motivation to show mercy here is bound up in himself. It's bound up in his reputation, not their behavior. It pleased God to make Israel his people. If he rejects them, this will tarnish his reputation of being a loving and kind and merciful God that he actually is. God is not steadfast and gracious because Israel deserved it, but rather this is just who he is, and it's outside of his character to act any other way. Which means we can come warts and all, or maybe slug and all, to him without fear when we sin. Don't spend another minute stewing in your guilt, hiding in your shame, losing sleep over something you have done, feeling the unbearable weight of your actions. Here, Israel committed a disastrous sin on a national level that we've been reading about for thousands of years. But God invited them to return to him and told them not to be afraid to do so. Despite all they did, despite all they had become, they received grace upon grace upon grace. And he welcomes us to do the same. When we face new situations in our life, it can bring out the worst of us. It really can. And perhaps in the last 12 months, you found yourself in a spot because of how you've handled a new situation. Where you've done something like Israel had done. Swap God for another. Something that looks shinier and newer because, well, maybe God didn't look like he was able to handle that situation you were facing. Maybe he wasn't the answer this time. And since then, you've ended up living outside of the ways God would have you to live. Friends, if that's you this morning, this is your chance to come again to God and renew the kingdom. To make God king again over your life. to repent for trusting in another, thinking that they could lead you in a better way, where we've seen it just doesn't stack up compared to God. This morning is your chance to realize the seriousness of your sin and the foolishness of trusting in another over God. And instead of finding disgust and wrath like we might expect from God, because Jesus died on the cross, you have the chance of finding forgiveness, and mercy, and grace instead. Because that's just what God is like. Will you answer the call to renew the kingdom this morning? Will you say to God, let your kingdom come rather than my own? Will you join your old king and his old ways in the new seasons to come? Will you call him Lord? To make this practical this morning, we're going to move into a time of communion together.